What kind of jobs do you do here?
Hangers, combs, clamshells.
Just do hangers and boxes, that's all.
Which one's the easiest one for you?
Hangers.
Amanda Morris has been meeting with workers at a type of employment facility that you might not have ever heard of. It's specifically for people with various kinds of disabilities. Amanda covers disabilities for The Post.
So we visited Pathways to Independence in Kearney, New Jersey, which is just outside of New York.
Hi.
And it was really interesting because it was actually like an old school building where all the classrooms were just filled with like desks, and workers were sitting at these different student desks doing various tasks.
Tasks like untangling piles of hangers for a uniform laundry service.
And in the other room, they were doing a bunch of other types of stuff like packaging hearing aids for Oticon, which is actually the hearing aid brand that I wear, and packaging combs and like assembling things in little boxes and stuff. The workers all seemed like they had various different types of disabilities, and some of them were way more chatty than others. And there was like a non-disabled staffer walking around monitoring them or sitting at the front of the classroom doing paperwork.
For months, Amanda and her colleagues have been investigating these kinds of workplaces, the work that people do there and how much they get paid. And Amanda got to talking with one of the workers.
So your name's Jamie?
Yes, I am.
How do you spell that? So Jamie Moonies is 33 years old. He has autism. He's a hard worker.
I'm making progress.
So we went over and we talked to Jamie about his job, and he seemed to like it. He didn't seem super thrilled about it, but he seemed to think it was okay. Do you like working here?
Yes.
Yeah?
So I can gain a skill. Yes, a job skill.
He also mentioned that in addition to disentangling the hangers, he does other things that the staff tells him to do, like making coffees or unloading boxes or raking leaves.
Recently, the staff asked me to assist them sorting files, paperwork, making copies.
But even though he's a very willing worker, he doesn't make a lot. Basically, employers in this program are allowed to pay people $1, $2 an hour.
Or in many cases, they're paid even less. In fact, paying people with disabilities well below minimum wage is completely legal in this country.
It is better than nothing.
But when Amanda and her colleagues started to look deeper into these programs, they discovered a system with little accountability or oversight. From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Tuesday, September 3rd. Today, we are bringing you an investigation into a labor system specifically for people with disabilities, one that pays sub-minimum wages. First, we'll learn about these programs through the eyes of one worker. And later in the show, we'll look at how employers have violated compensation rules and cheated disabled workers out of millions in pay. So, Amanda, you are looking specifically at these places that employ people with disabilities, and they pay below minimum wage. Can you explain what these facilities are and how they came to be?
So there's this program that employs people with disabilities and allows their employers to pay less than a minimum wage. It's called 14C. It's part of a law that dates back to like the Great Depression, when the president was trying to think of ways to help employ people. And people with disabilities, particularly veterans, were having a lot of trouble getting jobs.
Yeah.
And in order to help them find jobs, Congress decided, well, why don't we allow workers to make less than minimum wage if they have a disability? Because it's better to have a job than no job. Right?
So trying to incentivize these companies from back in, it sounds like the 1930s to essentially hire people with disabilities that they otherwise might not hire.
It's basically like a relic of that era.
So what does that look like now? The places that use quote-unquote 14C as the basis of their type of employment, how do they work?
So the way 14C works is that you have these employers who apply for a special certificate to pay people with disabilities less than minimum wage. And a lot of times those are nonprofits and they're employers that specifically try to provide employment services for people with disabilities. And they contract with outside facilities. And sometimes these are like big Fortune 500 companies like Honda or Rubbermaid.
Huh. And what are the kinds of things, when you talk about these large companies, names that we're familiar with, what are the kinds of work that they're essentially outsourcing to these nonprofits, work that is being given to people with disabilities to perform?
Often the type of work that's being outsourced to these facilities is menial, repetitive types of tasks. Like, for example, at Pathways to Independence, disentangling hangers over and over and over, or putting 4 combs into a bag and each comb has to be a different color. And sometimes those are tasks that are harder to do by machine, or sometimes those are tasks that often get outsourced to other countries. And for the companies, they see this as, oh, well, this is a way to keep this in the country, but also support people with disabilities.
So let me ask this. How many people are employed as part of this program?
It's difficult to know exactly how many workers are under this program, but the best estimates we've got are around 40,000 at the moment. And that number can change at any time because it's not really well tracked.
Mm-hmm.
The program's really shifted over the years. From the get-go, it was kind of unpopular with certain groups. And that means that it's slowly shifted towards predominantly employing people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And a lot of times it's their families who are afraid that they might not be able to get a job or afraid that they might not be safe in a community job. And they see these programs as a safe space to put their loved ones. Like, oh, hey, this is a way that my loved one can at least have a job. So it's families of people in the program that are often the biggest voices lobbying to support these programs.
And are programs like these, do they exist around the country?
This is a national program. So currently about 37 states participate in 14C, working under about 800 employers.
And the places that are employing people as part of this federal program, you said that they're nonprofits. So what is the goal of these nonprofits? And specifically for a place like Pathways to Independence, which we heard about at the beginning, like what is their goal?
A lot of them are designed to try to provide job training for people with disabilities, and many of them get taxpayer money to do that. And a lot of them will say, you know, we're not trying to make money off of people. We're genuinely trying to help people with disabilities be employed. And that's what the leaders at Pathways to Independence told me when I visited them. I met with Alvin Cox, the executive director there, and Tessa Farrell McFoy, the program director.
Not everybody is either ready or want to work in the community, but they are working actively. We run the program like it's work, just like any other person. They're coming in here, preparing to go to work. They're meeting friends. They're, just like any other person at their job. Yeah. They're doing the same thing.
And this basically is their job.
Yes. Right. They told me they take a lot of pride in helping people with disabilities be able to go someplace to prepare for a job in the community and sort of be this middle ground.
I really think that the program helps and benefits lots of the individual. We wish we could help more.
And the goal of the program is to assist the individuals to become as independent as they possibly can be. Independent in the home, independent in the community, independent on their jobs.
So obviously, this is what the people who run these kinds of programs are saying. But I would love to learn a little bit more about what the people who work at these places, who participate in these programs, what they're saying, and also what their families are saying. And at the beginning of this conversation, we heard a little bit about Jamie Muniz, who works at Pathways. I would love for you to take me a little bit deeper into Jamie, who he is, and how he came to work at this place.
Jamie Muniz was such a nice guy, and when we interviewed him, it was very clear that he really wants to be a good person and do hard work and be independent someday. Do you know how long you've worked here?
I worked here for 11 years.
11 years, wow.
I came here since 2013.
Is that when you graduated?
No, a year A
A
year
year,
after
okay.
I graduated.
I found myself wondering, how did Jamie end up here and why is he still here? So once I talked to his mom, Yamile Corrales, I got a much clearer picture of what happened. He was in high school and he had been diagnosed with autism, so he was pretty shy and sort of reserved.
He wouldn't communicate at all.
Really?
Yeah, it took him.
It's okay.
His-
Just let it out.
Okay, I will. Still, his skills were very limited. You would speak to him, he would just look at you like,
Interesting.
you know, or he would be very echoic, repeat everything you said. But as he's gotten older, he's gotten a lot better, more of his social skills. We treat him just like
Everybody else.
everybody else.
And he had actually applied for several jobs when he was in high school. He had applied for jobs at Sears and other types of stores like that, but he didn't do very well in his interviews. So she worked with his caseworker, and his caseworker said, oh, well, why don't you put him into this work training program at Pathways to Independence where he can gain the skills and confidence and then move on into a community job. And his mom thought that that sounded like a great idea. She told me that she thought he would be there for a couple of years and then he would move on.
What I was told was that they were going to develop his social skills, which he's come a long way. I'm not going to say no, right? And that the goal was for him to receive employment outside.
But he has been working there for the last 11 years and he's now 33 years old. So he hasn't
Basically,
had...
most of his adult life he has spent here at this place.
Exactly.
Where he's, I mean, it sounds like on the day that you saw him that he's sorting wire hangers.
Exactly.
And how does he feel about that?
He says he needs to move on.
They're going to new places to be independent.
But part of the issue is that when it is time to move on, if Jamie's spent so long disentangling hangers and then he wants to go work at CVS, does he have the skills he needs to help customers at CVS or restock shelves at CVS?
How much money does he make as part of this program?
So Jamie goes to work 5 days a week for about 5 hours a day. And while his paycheck can vary, it's usually not more than $100 every 2 weeks.
Wait, $100 for, if he's working 5 hours a day, 5 days of the week, that's 50 hours of work for $100.
Yeah. So if you look at some of his paychecks, it's less than $100. So some of the paychecks that they shared with me showed that Jamie made about $1.28 for every hour he spent there. That's his gross wages before taxes or deductions.
Oh my gosh. That must be so frustrating for him.
Yeah, so he has several siblings, and he's the only one that's still living at home. But he really wants to live independently. He wants to support himself like everybody else.
It's just, it isn't fair.
What's not fair?
The program is not being fair.
And why is not being fair? You have to explain yourself, remember?
My payment is not going well, and it's making our lives harder. A lot harder.
Listening to Jamie talk to his mom, I got the sense that he did feel really stuck and disempowered. And his mom kind of got swept up in that as well.
I feel sometimes once you go in this system, they put you in these little box and they want to keep you there.
Because this is what she was told to do. Put him into this work training program, and then he'll be ready for a job. But he's in this work training program, and he hasn't moved on to a job. And both of them just seemed a little bit at a loss as to why.
Well, it sounds like there are two issues here for him. There's the issue of the money, whether making less than $2 an hour is enough or fair for him. But also it sounds like he just wants to do something else, something that he's more passionate about, something that's more meaningful. Did you get a sense from him of like, you know, if he had the support and the training, like what he would imagine that life to look like?
100%. So he's got big dreams. He really wants to be a bartender.
A bartender?
I love making cocktails.
Really?
Yes.
Like what?
Let's see. Pina colada, blue Hawaiian.
So it was interesting because when I talked to him about bartending, his whole face lit up and he got really excited. And all of a sudden, he goes from sort of shy and reserved to much chattier and showing me different drinks that he makes.
This is my TikTok account.
Okay, let me write that down. Showing me videos on his TikTok that he makes. And he walks you through step by step how he makes the drink. He labels all the ingredients. It just opened up a whole other side of his personality.
So the impression that I'm getting is that there could be other potential employment opportunities for him, but that's not happening. And at the same time, as I said, he's making very little money. I'm wondering, for the folks who manage this facility, Pathways to Independence, what do they say about Jamie's situation?
Yeah, so Pathways to Independence will talk about the types of training that they do for people beyond just the type of work that he's doing, but also some of the soft skills of socialization, showing up to work on time, like learning how to follow instructions. And they do give their workers opportunities to say that they want to work in the community, and they do try to help workers move on when they feel like workers are ready for it. In Jamie's case, he did have an opportunity at one point to test out working at CVS, but it didn't work out for him and he didn't succeed with that job. So he went back to working at Pathways. So it's not like Pathways to Independence is telling workers, oh, you can't move on and we're not going to help you. But the difficult part about that, though, is that when I talked to experts and researchers, they said the best way to train somebody for a job in the community is to put them in the community with the right supports. There's not
in
really
this sort of self-segregated place where they are given repetitive tasks that aren't necessarily building those skills that would help them, work at a CVS or something like that.
Exactly.
But I also want to get back to the money question as well. You described the origins of this program from, you said essentially like the Depression before World War II, when the idea was the way that you could incentivize companies to employ people with disabilities is by allowing them to pay those people lower than minimum wage. And when you say that, it kind of makes sense to me, and maybe a little less than minimum wage doesn't feel like that big of a deal. But the numbers that you're describing here, Jamie making less than $2 an hour, you said that in your reporting some people are making as low as 25 cents an hour. I mean, that feels really surprising and extremely low, for anyone in the U.S. to be making 25 cents an hour doing anything. What is the response from Pathways to Independence specifically, but also from some of these other nonprofits that you've talked to, for why they are paying people so little for the work that they're doing?
I followed up with Alvin Cox, the executive director of Pathways to Independence, by phone, and I asked him about this after we looked into it more.
Some individuals may have not worked in the community and, feel comfortable.
And he talked about the fact that this is a choice that his workers make. Nobody's being forced into this.
It's basically, their choice in reference to working within the supportive employment program. They are aware that they are receiving subminimum wage for the work that they're doing. And some of the work, and again, because the individuals have some form of disability, they may not be doing the entire job. So that's why they receive a piece rate for the work that they're doing.
And also, some of them have tried to move on into community jobs and didn't succeed, either because they weren't capable or because they preferred to be at a place that provided more supports.
Are you going to be able to continue to work in the community independently or with limited supports? And then in asking all of those questions and speaking to the consumers, it's then more of, no, I don't think I'm ready at this present time to go into the community. I still need more support.
Pathways to Independence and other employers in this program that I talked to all talk about the fact that they would pay workers more if they could, but they can't afford to. And they discuss the fact that workers are getting paid according to how much they produce or how productive they're being according to different tests that are done. Executives at these programs talked about the fact that even after they get money from the government and they get money from their contract work, they still have to fundraise to fill the gaps. That's why they can't afford to pay more.
And to be clear, this is all like perfectly legal, correct?
Completely legal, yeah. One thing that's important to remember is that this program was started in the Great Depression era, and that was an era in which disabilities were viewed very different in this country, and the types of tools that we had to accommodate people with disabilities on the job were very different. So in the Great Depression era, disabilities were very much viewed as making a person lesser than, and people with disabilities were relegated to being second-class citizens. Fast forward to the 1990s, when the American with Disabilities Act was passed, that law made it very clear that people with disabilities should not be segregated and put aside and should not be treated as if they are less than everybody else. And that says if you discriminate against somebody with a disability for a job, that's against the law. And you have to accommodate people with disabilities on the job, as long as they are reasonable. And this program is sort of in conflict with that. I spoke with a couple of disability rights lawyers, and they talked about how the law doesn't really feel consistent on this point. Because on the one hand, we're saying people with disabilities deserve to be treated like everybody else. But then on the other hand, we have this law establishing a minimum wage for most people with a huge exception, which is that if someone has a disability, you can pay them less. So this program sort of continues to exist despite the fact that the world around it has changed.
After the break, we go beyond pathways to learn more about what Amanda and her colleagues uncovered in their investigation, and why many of the people affected are the ones who most adamantly support the program. We'll be right back. So, Amanda, my understanding is that your reporting hasn't just focused on Jamie or on this one nonprofit that employs him, but that you've been looking at the whole system and the various entities within that system. Can you talk about like the contours of the investigation that you have been doing with some of our colleagues?
Me, Caitlin Gilbert, and Jackie Alamany did a lot of work looking into the system. Basically, what we did was we investigated the labor practices of over 200 employers within this program. We interviewed over 40 current and former workers in the program. So if you've been here for 5 years, do you feel like you've gotten better in the last 5 years?
Yeah, not much.
As well as some of their family.
She is very content to be in the facility doing repetitive small parts assembly and things like that.
And then we interviewed over a dozen different employers and dozens of activists.
We know that the barriers are societal made barriers, not an inherent inability of people with disabilities.
Politicians and experts and researchers.
From my research perspective, the part that I could say is different vocational practices.
So those were the findings from 2 randomized control trials we've done with integrated service models.
And I think I read through hundreds of pages of reports and testimony given to Congress about this issue.
Wow. And after all of this, what did you find?
We don't have exact numbers on every year, but what we do know is that roughly 2% of workers move on from this program, according to a government accountability report. And very few workers are referred to the job services that they need to work in the community. That's like the main pathway for moving on. And then within the program itself, there's a lot of widespread issues. At least 38% of employers that are currently in the program have committed violations of labor law.
Wow.
Most of them are wage violations, meaning that the employers paid people incorrectly. And that's according to our own analysis of violations data shared with us from the Department of Labor. But it only scratches the surface. Last year, only 10% of employers were even investigated. And a vast majority of those investigations uncover violations. In our analysis, we saw that employers owed $20.2 million in back wages from October 2009 to September 2023. And then at the same time, many of these employers in the program get millions of dollars of taxpayer money to provide job training services. And not all states report how much money each facility gets, but we do know that it's in the hundreds of millions, and we know that some facilities get over $5 million a year of taxpayer money.
That's a lot of money.
And there's sort of this big question mark of whether or not those services are actually preparing people to succeed. When you combine all of our different findings, the biggest takeaway that me and the other two reporters had was this is a system that is designed to help train people with disabilities for jobs in the community. And it is not succeeding in that goal because workers are not moving on into the community.
And then when it comes to the question of how much or really how little some of these workers are being paid, what did your reporting say about the violations of labor law that were happening there?
So basically, employers in this program are allowed to pay people $1, $2 an hour, and sometimes they can't even do that correctly. There was a 2020 U.S. Commission on Civil Rights report that described the program as being rife with abuse with regards to wages. And that was similar to what we found as well in our investigation. There's very little oversight of the companies within the program, but of the companies that are investigated, a vast majority of them find violations of the law. So oftentimes what's happening is people are calculating these subminimum wages using complicated productivity type tests, and the way that they're calculating the wages ends up being incorrect. So they pay people less than what they should actually be getting paid based on their productivity. Or they don't pay people at all. Or there's other issues with following the law that result in companies having to pay back wages and things like that. And we saw this at some of the facilities we visited as well. At Pathways to Independence, they had multiple investigations in the last decade and found multiple violations of wage law.
And to be clear, that's the place where Jamie was working.
Exactly. And they told us that all of it was a result of a miscalculation in wages and that they weren't rounding wages properly. But they said that they're using the proper calculations now. Pathways to Independence also did have to pay back wages to the workers that were underpaid. One thing that's interesting about the violations is that the workers themselves don't always know when they're being incorrectly paid. And that raises questions about transparency and fairness, as well as workers' abilities to enforce their own rights.
Have you talked to the Department of Labor about what you've been reporting on, the investigation that you did, and like what they have to say about what you've been looking at?
The Department of Labor is aware that there's issues with this program, and they told us that they actually focus more of their enforcement resources on this program than they do in other areas of labor law because of those issues. However, they actually have very limited resources, and they have to investigate laws that impact millions of workers at millions of workplaces across the country. So with very limited resources, they have to do a lot, and they can't devote all of their resources to investigating every single employer under this program.
Have there been people trying to raise more awareness about this and show the shortcomings of this program and arguing that maybe this thing from the 1930s shouldn't be the way that we do this right now?
A lot of disability rights organizations have been pushing back against this program for years, and it's a really big issue in the disability community. But what drew me to the story initially was sort of this conflict that occurs. A lot of the times when I talk to disabled workers who used to work under this program and used to make subminimum wages, they are very much against the program and they want to see it phased out, like Brad Teslow.
Until you're part of the regular culture and society, you're always going to be a second-class citizen at best.
But then when you talk to workers that are currently in the program and have never worked anywhere else, they don't want the program to go away. This was the case for another worker I talked to, Tim Bennett. If you weren't doing this, is there anything that you really would want to do?
No, I love coming here. I love the support I get from everybody, staff, and the way they put it together for me so I can show off my good talent.
They're like, oh, I'm okay here. I'm happy here. You know, I've got my mom and dad. I'm living at home with them. Everything's fine. And then you talk to parents. Like one woman I spoke with who has a son with an intellectual disability in one of these programs, Debbie Buffer, and they agree.
He's around people that are like him and people that have some disabilities that he can relate to and doesn't have to worry about being bullied or being made fun of.
A lot of the parents specifically chose this program because they felt like it was the best option for their loved one, and they felt like it was safe and it was reliable and stable.
So it sounds like these families, many of them don't actually want this program to go away or aren't concerned about this argument that it might be unfair to pay their kids, their family members, so much lower than minimum wage.
Yeah, and when I asked them about the wage specifically, they say, oh, well, no one would ever pay my son minimum wage. That's just not realistic. They won't do it.
Their thinking is that their loved one might not perform a task as quickly as other people or would need more help with it, and therefore they just are doubtful that they would be employable.
Right. And I understand the doubts and the fears, but then I usually ask, have you tried? And the response is usually no, from the people that I interviewed at least. And the other thing I thought was really interesting was some employers have voluntarily transitioned away from using these certificates and from paying subminimum wages. And they told me that when they initially announced that they were going to do this, they got some really loud pushback from some of the families in their own organizations that did not want them to make this transition. You know, I understand parents' fears, right? What parent doesn't fear for their child not being able to get a job or not being treated well at work? So they see it as, oh, this is a place they can socialize and feel safe and welcomed. But within disability rights organizations, they talk a lot about the dignity of failure. So a lot of parents don't want to see their children fail.
Which I think is true across the board for everybody's parents.
Yeah, regardless of whether or not you have a disability, you don't want your child to be hurt or to be unemployed or whatever. But disability rights organizations argue that you have to give your child a chance to fail in order to learn, right? We always talk about failure is a way that you can learn things. And they say that there's this dignity in being able to fail, in trying it out to see if you can do it before being told, no, you can't.
And what I found really interesting from your reporting was that both anecdotally, as you said, there are success stories of people who were in these programs, decided this isn't going to get me where I want to go. And they were able to seek out other opportunities and actually successfully get a job. But also, according to your reporting, that in some of the states where they've ended these programs, you've actually seen an uptick in the employment levels of people with disabilities. Can you explain what happens there?
Yeah, this was encouraging to me to see that employers were willing to hire people with disabilities, and maybe the stigma and stereotypes could be overcome. So what's happening in some of these states where the program is getting phased out is that states are reallocating resources towards supporting people in jobs in the community. And we found that in 8 states that ended the program, employment rates for people with cognitive disabilities went up by at least 14% between the time the programs ended and 2022.
What I find so fascinating about that is it sounds like what the critics of this 14C program are saying is that this law almost demonstrates a lack of imagination of what life could look like for people with disabilities and what an alternative could be that would be more productive and satisfying for people, and that this law is sort of premised on the idea of this is all people are capable of, when we don't know that that's the case.
One former 14C facility that I interviewed, called Millwood in Virginia, spoke about how they used to have people doing more routine manufacturing assembly type work. And then when they decided to phase out 14C for themselves and start paying people minimum wage or above, and integrating their workforce, they completely switched the type of work that people were doing. They didn't do manufacturing anymore. They did more like tech support and call center work. And all of a sudden they had workers being able to make so much more money and succeeding at other types of work. Executives at Melwood would say that the way that they used to have things set up was not very expansive in terms of allowing people with disabilities to try out different things. And I think critics of the program do say, yeah, it's a lack of imagination. Like, have you thought about ways that we can accommodate people? Have you thought about different types of jobs that they might be able to do? Have you assessed their strengths rather than their weaknesses?
So what's the status of the debate around all this now? What are the efforts currently happening to try to change this law?
Various states have moved to phase out 14C and subminimum wages, and some employers have decided to just do it voluntarily before states even mandate that. But at the federal level, it's still totally legal and allowed, and there are still 37 states that allow this program to continue. So some states are doubling down and saying, we want to keep this program. Some states are voluntarily phasing it out and passing laws to do that. But advocates who want the program shut down say there really needs to be change at the federal level rather than the state-by-state level. Otherwise, this program is just going to continue in some form in some place in this country.
And is there any indication that that shift at the national level is happening?
There's been a growing pressure to make that change at the federal level. A number of different government agency reports over the last decade have come out advocating for the program to be ended completely. And it looks like the Department of Labor is actually going to make a move on this. They haven't said exactly what they're going to do yet, but our reporting indicates that they're likely to propose stronger enforcement of the program's rules, and it's possible they might just phase out the program completely.
But even if the federal government is planning to take action on this, how much would that really change in terms of people's experiences in this program?
It'll be interesting in the coming months to see what the Department of Labor rule is going to be and how families and workers react to it. I have a sense that families of workers in the program are going to be some of the loudest, most vocal opponents to any sort of proposal to end or phase out the program. And that might hinder federal action. I don't know if it'll stop it completely. We'll have to wait and see.
Amanda, thank you so much for sharing this reporting.
Thanks for having me.
Amanda Morris reports on disabilities for The Post. Our colleagues Caitlin Gilbert and Jacqueline Alamani also contributed to this reporting. The Post is reporting on so many other stories today. So before we go, here's another one that we wanted to share with you. Over the Labor Day weekend, thousands of hotel workers walked off the job. They were striking for higher pay, increased staffing, and reduced workloads. In at least 9 cities, more than 25,000 workers walked out of Hilton, Marriott, and Hyatt properties, among others. And more workers could walk out if negotiations take longer. On Tuesday, outside the Hilton Boston Park Plaza, that strike continued. The Post travel reporter Andrea Sachs noticed all sorts of disruptions at that hotel. A woman from the sales department was bartending at the hotel bar, housekeeping was only available for departures, and piles of used towels lined the hallways. Unite Here is the National Hospitality Union leading the strike. They accused hotels of using COVID-era lockdowns as a pretext to cut jobs and eliminate guest services. The union is also asking guests with reservations at affected hotels to not cross the picket line. They want guests to cancel their stay immediately and demand a refund without a cancellation fee. Hyatt and Hilton both said in statements that they are committed to negotiating with Unite Here, and they have plans in place to minimize the strike's impact on hotel operations. That's it for Post Reports. Thanks for listening. If you are looking for the latest updates on the big news of the day, check out our morning news briefing, The 7. We bring you through the 7 stories that you need to know about every weekday morning by 7 a.m. You can listen to it wherever you listen to podcasts. Today's show was produced by Alana Gordon, with help from Sabby Robinson and Ariel Plotnick. It was mixed by Sam Baer and edited by Rena Flores. Thanks to Emily Kodik, Akila Johnson, Lauren Gurley, and Andrea Sachs. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.